The thoughts from a Nigerian living in the diaspora, Dele Ogun, a lawyer, the author of A Fatherless People and the convener of the Fatherland Group. Dele Ogun, it's a pleasure to have you in the channel's Business Global studio. It's less than 18 hours that the polls are going to be open. I've said this continuously throughout the show, but the world's gaze is squarely on Nigeria at the moment. On Monday, Nick Cheeseman, who happens to actually be, I believe, a UK lecturer, he wrote an essay in the Wall Street Journal that said some observers already consider Nigeria a failed state. What are these actors observing?
What are the signs? We remember the Kaduna Abuja train kidnapping incident. I speak from experience. I was one who contributed towards the 100 million that was paid to rescue my best man from that train after months of kidnapping.
Goodness, I didn't know that.
That's part of the reality. The other reality is that every time I go to Nigeria, historically, I would always go to my village. But the security situation, by virtue of those kidnapping episodes, the frequency, the regularity, and the impunity with which it was being conducted, meant that I haven't been able to go. That's part of the reality. The up-to-date reality is people, Nigerians, being reduced to trade by barter, by virtue of this currency crisis that the has generated with this mad currency change. That is part of the reality. The other significant, and perhaps the most significant, is this. We know that troops have been out on the streets against Boko Haram, ISIS in the north, almost, well, for as long as we can remember.
13-year insurgency.
That's the reality out there, troops out. We also know that troops have been deployed repeatedly in the Middle Belt areas, the southern Kaduna crisis, where troops are having to be called in. We know that troops have been in occupation of certainly Igbo land for as long as this administration has been in power, since 2015. And most recently, just last week, we saw troops being deployed to Lagos. Now remember,
that's for safety.
Whatever the reason.
That's
the
for
mere fact that you
purposes.
have to deploy troops, police are supposed to deal with that. Law and order is supposed to deal with that, not those who are trained to kill.
Nigerian society, as we know, is one of the most diverse in the world. And I think sometimes from the outside looking in, you're like, oh my goodness, it's so complex. How is this mosaic working? What are the hopes? And I want us to try to be as optimistic as we can. What are the hopes from the diaspora? You are the convener of a global network of Nigerians, the Fatherland Group. I know you do extensive work. You hold huge conferences, both online and in person. You speak to them on a daily basis. What are we hoping for as power changes hands next week?
The structure that we need is one that reflects and runs with the groove. The groove of Nigerians is their ethnic identity. It is their Hausa, it is their Igbo, it is their Kanuri, their Ijaw, their Yoruba, Fulani identity. If you work with that reality, then you can have a stable union. We've been running with denial, you see, but now the international community can see in the Ukraine crisis, you see the problem of ethnicity with the Donbass region, that it's what is source for the goose is source for the gander, because the model that the Fatherland Group has proposed, we call it the Orange Union, because when you peel the skin of the orange, you see the segments sitting comfortably side by side, unique and distinct, but forming part of the whole. So Nigeria doesn't have to be scattered and broken up. It just needs to be reconfigured along its natural lines, natural dimensions.
We're running out of time, and I do want to get your point on this before we close the show. Again, it's an obvious question, but is it fair to say that the outcome of tomorrow's ballot is going to shape the political and economic prospects, not just for Nigeria, but for the entire region, and dare I say it, the world.
It is a defining election in terms of where Nigeria goes from here.
It's always a pleasure speaking with you, Dele Ogun.
It's a pleasure.
Author, historian, lawyer, convener of the global network, a global Nigerian network, the Fatherland Group, also Fatherless People, absolutely insightful reading, life-affirming read, actually. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
For your honest overview and your predictions. Thank you, Dele.
Thanks so much.
Thanks, Teddy. Now to our final topic. February the 24th marks the first anniversary of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The crisis has killed hundreds of thousands of people, left 5.9 million Ukrainians internally displaced, and nearly 8 million refugees from Ukraine have been recorded living in neighbouring countries. While the world has been impacted with higher prices for natural gas and a stark shift in geopolitical allegiances, Africa's divided stance on the Russian invasion has courted a wave of criticism, particularly as South African government officials recently referred to Russia as a friend. To help me unpack this, I was earlier joined in the studio by Timothy Modu, a strategist and an emerging power analyst. Timothy Modu, it's an absolute pleasure to have you in the Channel's Business Global studio today. February 24th marks a year, can you believe it, since the onset of this illegal invasion of Ukraine by Russia. If you are living in the global north, like we are, then of course you're hearing about all of the negative impact this is having on citizens, including here in the UK. Yep. Sky high rocketing inflation because of our reliance upon natural gas. But what are your thoughts on the impact this is having on Africa, which is something we don't typically talk about, but of course this is affecting all corners of the globe?
Listen. Thank you, Juliana, for having me. It's always a pleasure to give an opportunity to speak on this. It's a very important milestone, 1 year into this war that we didn't know anything about. It's the impact of it is just devastating for Africa. It is something that, if you think of the situation where Africa have been just coming out of the COVID situation, you look at all the indices, everything just indicates that the worst thing that could happen to Africa is another burden of something that they don't know anything about coming in and then hitting us hard. So it's sad that this war has continued up to this point. What we know for sure is that it's benefited nobody. You have, on the 24th of this month, you will have 1 year, 12 months of this. And in this process, thousands of people have died.
Hundreds of thousands.
Exactly, have died. And you have people who, 14 months ago in Ukraine didn't even know what's about to hit them. 8 million of them have to be displaced. About 7.9 million of that number have to find themselves somewhere to live. So overall, it's something that we're still asking questions to understand what is the reason, what's the rationale, what's behind it, because the costs to everybody is unbelievable.
There have been waves of criticism about Africa's stance, particularly sub-Saharan Africa's stance, a neutral stance.
Right.
Some would say that neutral stance in the war is becoming slightly friendlier to Russia. I believe there was a trip by Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister, to South Africa, where diplomats in South Africa openly called him a friend. We haven't seen Sergei Lavrov smile in a while. He was certainly smiling. Yeah. When he was in South Africa, this is triggered criticism from the White House and various other places. What are your thoughts on Africa's stance on this war? Should we be joining the allies in the global north and in the west in condemning this invasion?
Well, there are two angles to it, and I will be brief on this. One is the geopolitical nuances, new knowledge that we've just gained. COVID gave us some ideas, but this war really exposed Africa to the point where we're at a point of no return now. The concept of global north and global south, we are actually onlookers. If you go deep into it, we're not really either. So the position Africa should be taking, and this is very important, is to begin to look at what I call Africa consensus. Africa to have their own consensus of their position with global north or global south on issue. If you look at the voting in particular, the UN voting that happened, Brazil, even though they were part of BRICS, actually did vote against Russia's wish, even though they were part of BRICS. So it tells you that actually some people, some countries have actually figured it out. And so Africa should have our own, what I call Africa consensus.
Do we not have a consensus? The consensus being neutral, pro-Russia?
No. I think the consensus I'm referring is to actually be proactive,
right,
and then operate from a position of strength. If you look at the so-called concept of superpowers and emerging powers, what actually constitutes a superpower is either you have a soft power, and that soft power depends on your economy and the resources you use to build your economy, or you have a hard power, which is the military way. Whichever way you look at both powers, Africa is still a strategic partner contributing resources if you're on the hard power side, or in the soft power, whether it's minerals you need. So these big institutions, so-called emerging powers, actually depend on key resources of Africa, and we have abundance of it. So why would you be supplying somebody a strategic resource and they don't see you as a strategic partner? So that's what the consensus for me is. So we start from the position of strength and use our position of strength, what we have, and renegotiate our relationship with everybody. Global South, Global North. It doesn't matter.
Gosh, Tim, you've opened up a can of worms here whilst we're running out of time. But I do want to your response to this.
Right.
Are the criticisms from the White House about, let's talk about South Africa now.
Right.
And they're calling Russia a friend.
Yeah.
At a time when it's killing.
They have no moral grounds. White House doesn't have any moral grounds to make that judgment call. Okay. South Africa have demonstrated very clearly that they have the mind of their own.
Yeah.
And Africa need to learn from that. We are capable of making judgmental calls.
Yeah.
And we don't have to kowtow to anybody anymore.
Goodness me,
that's
it's such a fascinating discussion, and something I think we're going to have to revisit,
yes,
perhaps during or after that 1 year anniversary. Really insightful, feasting upon your knowledge. Timothy Modu, strategist and emerging power analyst. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you. Nice.